What's going on, folks? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm pretty psyched to have everybody aboard today. Excited to have your ears, and I really appreciate you listening to this podcast. On today's podcast, we have a great friend of mine that I have had the pleasure of knowing for the last several years as both a friend and also as a colleague that I've had at CTS. On the podcast today, we have Dominic Guinto, who is our Athlete Services Director. And since the title Athlete Services Director is going to be unfamiliar to almost everybody, it's just something that we made up. Let me explain a little bit about what Dominic does on a day-to-day basis. Dominic is really the front-facing person of all of our initial athlete inquiries. Whenever we have a new athlete that comes to CTS, inevitably Dominic is the first person that they encounter. In fact, even when people ask me personally about coaching, whether they reach out to me via email or via social media, or even if I meet him at a race, I am always steering them towards Dominic. So he quite literally is the front man in every kind of sense of the word. He has a knack for being able to suss up an athlete situation and determine exactly what they need from a coaching or a camps or a support perspective, and then getting them within the right services within CTS. So I brought Dominic on the podcast to really discuss what makes a good coach-athlete relationship. And I really wanted to do this in an endeavor for the audience out there that's listening to start to think about, if you do want to come into the coaching space, what things should you be thinking about, and how can you set up that relationship? Correctly on the right foot from the get-go? The landscape out there right now in terms of coaches is enormous, and it's extremely difficult for athletes to determine what one coach is going to bring to the table versus another one. And all too often, we tend to lean on our friends and our running partners for advice in terms of what coach to pick if we do decide that we want to coach. And that's a fine way to do it. But there's a much bigger world out there. And so in order to not have this podcast turn into an hour-long sales pitch for CTS coaching, what I really wanted to bring out of the discussion from Dominic is regardless of where you are in that relationship of your running or in that relationship of you starting out with a new coach, how can you design the interview process that you are going to undertake with this potential new coach to ensure that you get matched up with the best one? And there's a lot of incredible insights that Dominic has, because this is what he does for a living. In any given month, he's matching up anywhere between 40 up to 100 athletes that come in the door with our CTS coaches. And there aren't a lot of people. In fact, I would place a good bet on there's nobody that has more experience in doing that in the endurance space than this man that we brought on the podcast for this particular episode. So I hope the audience, if you are considering coaching, that you take a lot of the advice that Dominic has to heart and really think about the choices that you make and how you want to evaluate what coach is ultimately going to be the right one for you, whether it's me or another one of our coaches or somebody else that you pick. Who knows? You might find the right coach for you is somebody that you've never even heard of before. And I think that a lot of the advice that Dominic has for the listeners here will ring true for anybody that is out there that is considering taking on a new coach. In addition to that, if you are getting coaching, whether it's from me or one of our coaches or another coach, I also think that some of the things that we mentioned throughout the podcast can kind of illuminate, is this the right match for you? And that's a tough discussion to make. And we go through at the end of this podcast what to do when that coach-athlete relationship does go awry, and why, in fact, does it go awry in certain cases. So I hope you guys get a lot from this conversation. I found it really fun. I always have a good time with Dominic. We, ironically enough, we recorded this conversation remotely due to some of the restrictions with the COVID-19 pandemic, and he only lives about a mile from me as the crow flies. In fact, I'm going to run over and pick up the microphone that I lent him for this podcast. So he's a very near and dear friend of mine. He lives right around the corner. We get to see each other every once in a while on the trails here in Colorado Springs when he's hucking around on his mountain bike, and I am out there on a run. I really do always appreciate the time that I get to spend with him, whether it's in person or virtual, as has been the case recently. So perk your ears up. Without any further ado, here we go. Here is our Athlete Services Director, Dominic Guinto.
We're going to have one of two extremes. People are going to emerge from quarantine 15 pounds heavier, or they're going to emerge fitter than they were before.
So there's some other interesting, I wouldn't call it data, but like straw poll data that people have started to take on Twitter. So one of the physiologists that a lot of the coaches follow, Steven Seiler, he put out a survey. He's got a pretty good microphone. So he put out a survey to all the endurance athletes that follow him and just asked them what their what their trends were like. The athletes that were training less than 10 hours were training more, and the athletes that were training greater than 10 hours were training less. And it predominantly centered around the long ride. So the long rides of like 4 or 5 hours were getting cut down to like 2 because people can't stand being on the trainer that much.
Right. And that person that was only riding 3 days a week for an hour each time, all of a sudden got to ride 6 days a week for an hour and a half each time.
Have you gotten like the Zwift specific requests yet? Like, hey, I'm using Zwift a lot. Can your coaches use that or anything like that? Have you seen that flow through?
Yeah. Not often, but people ask specifically, can I do all my rides in Zwift? Sure. I don't know why you would. But.
Hey, some people, it's the safest thing for them to do. They work out early in the morning. They don't want to put all their lights on. They live in congested area.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah,
I have a feeling. It's interesting to see. I've noticed it with Zwift probably more than anything. A perfect example is Doug's wife, Trish.
Mm-hmm.
She's super strong athlete.
Mm-hmm.
I ride my bike because I love riding my bike. I ride it anywhere, anytime. She rides her bike because it's a workout for her. And she is committed to Zwift constantly.
Yeah.
Like it's every workout, every group ride, even if it's nice out, she's on Zwift.
Wow.
And you start to realize your goal, everyone's goal is different. I mean, this is where all this stuff goes. And let's face it. So let's get started.
Yeah, let's get into it, man. Everybody's goal is different. That's a perfect launch point, man. So I mean, at this point, just to set the stage between you and I will have given you some glowing intro about who you are, what your background is, specifically what you do to CTS. So you don't have to like run through the whole thing, but you play a few different roles within CTS and especially within the roles that you kind of interact with our athletes. Just as a short overview, let's just take a quick punch list really quick on like your main interaction points within the athlete base that we have.
So I'm the first person that a new athlete or potentially new athlete would come to, whether that's through a coach or through an email. In the best situation, I get the opportunity to speak to the athlete first, answer questions, and so forth. But as far as overall duties are for me to speak to the athlete, find out what they're looking for, and find the right coach for them. The other touch points I have with athletes are current athletes that have either customer service questions, they need to change a credit card on their account, they want to sign up for a camp, they want to buy a CTS kit, they'd like to schedule a private camp with their coach, whatever that may be. All of those things typically come to myself or someone on my team in athlete services. But but primarily with coaching, I'm that first contact with all of the athletes.
And so for this conversation, I want to focus on two areas. Is one, just what you mentioned. We're going to get into that first. You're the first touch point and discuss what athletes ask you, and then how you take that information to make sure that you can start to create the best coach-athlete relationship possible, specifically by matching them with the right coach. And then the second one is I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about when coach-athlete relationships go awry. And they do with any, coaching business, with any relationship, not just coach-athlete.
With any relationship. Absolutely.
That definitely has the potential for happen. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So when you first come into contact with a new athlete, what do they ask you, and what are your steps of trying to figure out what the best course of action is for that athlete to get them to the right coach?
It's an interesting question, because there have been times, and not often, that the person's not looking for a coach at all. So I can't just assume that every time an athlete comes in the door and has a question about coaching. So believe it or not, those are some of my first questions. Is are you looking for a coach? Are you looking for a coach to work with? Because oftentimes it's they want to spend a couple hours on the phone with the coach and just talk about their training plan that they've set up in the future and so forth. So just asking some general questions on my part is typically a good idea to find out where to start. And that typically leads to asking more detailed questions on what sport are you training for? Or what sports are you training for? Have you worked with a coach in the past? And that allows the athlete to start talking and gives me most of the information that I'm going to need, and then I can kind of refine things from there. But the initial questions that athletes will have for me are, I am this type of athlete. I am this old. I have this particular goal. Do you coach athletes like me?
Which is always funny, because we've had this experience for years where everybody thinks that coaching is just for the elite athletes, or just for the best of the best, or just for the sponsored athletes. And just as well as anybody else does that, they might make up 5% of our entire athlete base, maybe.
Right.
Yeah, maybe that. The rest of it it's everybody. And so the answer to that question is it's always, I'm going to put words in your mouth. It seems like it's always yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, sure. It looks good on paper when, we can advertise elite athletes and, world champions and so forth. Those things are great. Those are not the majority of our athletes. We have over 1,200 athletes at any one time that we coach. Yeah. But they're 5% of those would still be a lot of elite athletes.
So outside of the sport specificity part of that line of questioning, right? What sport are you training for? How old you are, the demographic information and things like that. What are the key pieces of intel that you get on each athlete that start to give you a direction on, I think this person would be the right coach for that athlete. I think that person would be the right coach for this athlete.
As unscientific as this sounds, a lot of it is personality. Athletes' personality, the way that they describe their goals, the way that the passion in which they speak about their sport, some of their past experience. A lot of that has to do, helps me in picking a coach that fits a personality that's similar. Again, you and I have talked in the past about this before. You've got to assume that all CTS coaches, for instance, have got the scientific and education background, and the athlete also have to assume that this athlete has told me, what level of coaching they're looking for, monthly payment wise, communication wise, and so forth. I can now start thinking about the coaches that fit into that category, and now start matching the personalities. I take that information, and then I will always outwardly ask, what type of athlete do you think you are? and what type of motivation works for you. Do you need a drill instructor or do you need a cheerleader? Again, we've talked about this before, Koop, and everyone responds differently. And a lot of that information that the athlete gives and talking about their goals and their passion and so forth will come through in that. And then I like to clarify with asking, do they want a drill instructor or a cheerleader?
It's interesting that you mentioned like the workflow of how you go through that, because a lot of times the way that we describe this is that you're assigning athletes to coaches, but in reality, that works out part of the time, meaning you get an athlete and you know, hey, this is the right coach for you. 100%. I already know it. Whatever the circumstance is, this is that right person. They requested the coach specifically would be a good example of that. Or that coach has a really narrow area of specificity that the athlete is particularly keen on. But in most cases, what you're actually doing is steering the athletes, right? You're collecting this information, you're figuring out what their personality looks like and things like that. And you're kind of like steering them into the right direction. And like one of the tools that has emerged over the last few years is this coach consult tool that we tend to use. Why don't you describe that a little bit?
Well, it's interesting. Let's go a little bit further past the coach consult tool. And when I started with CTS almost 8 years ago now, when someone signed up for coaching, you were a cycling athlete and you got assigned to a cycling coach. And, you mentioned that some of your goals were, a Leadville or a road race, whatever it is. And we picked a coach that had some similar backgrounds, and people just got assigned. Over the last several years, the market has kind of pushed us that way, and athletes have pushed us that way. And that would be, I'd like to interview. Can I interview my coach? Can I talk to the coach? Can I see if this is a good fit? And based on that request or need from the athlete, we kind of refined our system and changed things up to give athletes the opportunity to speak to. Of course, you got to have some basic rules, but that would be to speak with two coaches that we assign to them to speak with. We schedule an appointment. We make an introduction, I should say, between the athlete and the coaches through two individual emails. And then directly that athlete and each individual coach will set up a call to speak for 15 or 20 minutes to see whether this is a good fit or not. And I tell the athletes that the goal of this call is not to find out what every day of coaching is going to look like, or what every day of training is going to look like. The goal of this call is to have a 15 or 20 minute human to human conversation to see if this is somebody that you would look forward to speaking to each week. More often than not, more than 50% of the time, I get calls back from the athletes after they've had both of their coach consult calls with the question of, I don't know who to pick. Can you help me out? Which coach should I choose? And I come back to them with the same question each time. You should pick the coach that you organically just got off that call with and thought to yourself, I would look forward to speaking to them each week, to sharing with them my details about my training, details about my diet, details about my sleep. I trust the answers that they're going to give me. Do you know all of that for sure in 20 minutes? Of course not. But again, we've all done this enough, whether it's in business or in our personal lives, where you meet new people, and you can immediately decide whether this is somebody that you'd like to spend a little bit more time with.
It's so funny because even in the ambivalent situation, you get a new athlete in, you set up the consults between these two coaches, and it's really more of it's a social interview versus a technical interview for all intents and purposes. Should be. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the right way to counsel people. Absolutely. And then when you get the feedback from that athlete, hey, I still don't know. And that's a completely reasonable piece of feedback based on meeting somebody for 20 or 30 minutes for the first time. Still, the direction is steering, not assigning, right? It's not you. And in all fairness, our coaching group, our 50 some odd coaches, better than anybody else in the company, including the CEO, including myself, including everybody, marketing director, whoever else you want to
I'm
name.
confident of that.
Yeah, 100%. Still, even at that, despite the kind of the intimacy which our entire coaching staff, you're still leaning on the athlete to make the decision. Why is that? Why is that so important for the athlete to make the end all be all decision?
So I can't be to blame later on. I'm kidding. I think it really is best for the athlete to go through this process, and the athlete, by posing additional questions to this athlete, the athlete can start to make that decision on their own, which lends to the beginning of kind of the basis of the reason why all people want coaching, and that is to gain some confidence. And they need to know that they made this decision on their own. They go into it confidently. Some athletes, once they've selected their coach, they don't start for a week or 2 weeks or 3 days, whatever it is. During that time, I think by asking them questions and allowing to make that choice on their own and just guiding them, they will feel more confident that they've gone through the right process, rather than, hey, take a look at the coaches that we have on our bio page, pick the coach that you want, and we'll get them assigned to you. I don't think that they would feel that confidence there. But it's almost like you're giving them some homework to do and forcing them to really think about what their wants and their needs are after they've spoken to the coaches. So I think it's really important that they are vested in that decision.
Yeah, and it also helps create buy-in with the whole coach-athlete relationship. I've always found that if it's some third party, whether it's you or what we kind of more commonly see in the coaching world is a friend or a friend of a friend vouch for another coach, and then that third party is then creating the buy-in. When it's the athlete, the person who's directly involved with the relationship, when they're the one that is ultimately having to create that initial part of the buy-in, the connection is a lot more valuable. And it makes the coaching more efficacious as well, because belief is a big part of how coaching works. Yeah, you got to have correct training structure, and it has to be, based in sound science and proper methodology and blah, blah, blah. But if the athlete truly believes that they have the right coach for them, they believe in what the coach is doing, that is a just gigantic part in their development as an athlete. And to your point, for them to develop a lot of confidence.
I was thinking of something when you were talking, and it's a perfect example, but I never recommend a husband and wife or spouses or best friends immediately accepting the same coach.
We get that husband and wife request a lot. How often do you see that?
I would say often. I would say, once or twice a month, it's either a husband and wife or father and son we get often. But people that are, or two training partners that are maybe doing a duo type event.
Yeah. And it's always well intended, those requests, the husband-wife requests, but we always steer them away from it because you can insert your athlete services hat, or you can put on your athlete services hat again. We specifically recommend that, or recommend against that, because of why?
Because all athletes should feel like they are the first priority of the coach, and it is human nature, and inevitably the coach has their call with the husband or the wife, or both of them together. One person dominates the conversation and the other person doesn't get their questions asked or answered. The training ends up looking like it's kind of being copied, but they're just using some different zones and so forth. I tell them all the time that if they're going to be paying for coaching service for two people, if they use two separate coaches, they're gaining twice the amount of knowledge as well.
That's true.
So I've always recommend that they have different coaches, because they both feel like they're getting they're getting the attention that they need.
Duncan Callahan and I coach a husband-wife duo. I coach the wife, and he coaches the husband. And you know them; they've come to our camps before. But inevitably, we always have these like in parallel, hilarious coach athlete calls. Me with my athlete, and Duncan with his athlete that has some sort of crossover with the other party's training. Right. But to your point, I can say, yeah, that's a smart thing for Duncan to do. Okay, let's rearrange the schedule in this other way to kind of accommodate for your training plan as well as your husband's training plan or whatever it is.
Well, I think, hey, there's something else that you just kind of brought up there that made me think of, again, it just being human nature. You're going to work a little bit harder, and Duncan's going to work a little bit harder because he knows that the information is in the same house. And you're like, wow, my coach didn't do that, or my coach didn't do that. And yeah, it's actually it's a good situation to be in.
Well, when you know your work is being checked, like all students know, their thesis checked or their homework checked or whatever it is, you're always going to put in a little bit extra effort when you've got that little bit of oversight. In our coaching group, this is not related to the conversation we're having, but our coaching group has that a lot where where we got each other's backs and we're going to check each other's work to a lot of extent.
Right.
Let's circle back to this coach athlete match and continue to run through the scenario of you have an athlete contact you, you've gathered some basic information and steered them towards two coaches. They have the coach consult at that point. I want to dig a little bit deeper into how you would advise the athlete not only to handle that conversation, as you mentioned, you're looking for the personality match. I want to get a little bit more detail there, but also after they've had this compare and contrast, what are some things that they can do to make sure that they are getting the right coach for them? Because there's going to be a lot of people that are listening to this podcast that are trying to do a form of that across a lot of different, like more or less platforms. They're looking at coaching websites and they're saying, okay, I see what this coach brings to the table. They're interviewing other coaches in a very similar format to how you steer coaches and athletes with those coach consults. And I think that there's some information to kind of further be gleaned on how that interview process can be best handled by an athlete who's evaluating a few different coaches. So why don't you go back and dive into that a little bit more in terms of what the athlete should be specifically pulling out of that out of that initial interview?
The athlete should be pulling out of it what they have decided ahead of time that they're looking for from coaching. And the athlete needs to decide, am I looking for a relationship with somebody to speak to each week? Am I looking for a PR on a particular race I've done in the past? Am I simply looking to be the most fit I've ever been? I want to keep up with the front group on the Saturday morning ride. I want to run a certain hill without stopping, whatever it may be. They need to decide what that is. They need to think about a little bit about how they communicate and how they like to communicate. And again, keeping it simple, go into the call with those things in mind. Don't get necessarily distracted by those shiny things. Oh, this person won the bear. This person, has completed this particular event more times than anyone else. It does not mean that elite athletes can't be great coaches, but it also doesn't mean that mediocre athletes can't be great coaches either. So to not get distracted by those things and truly go into it with what they are looking for. Because and this kind of comes back to that husband and wife thing, what my goals are not the same as yours. So the greatest coach in the world might not be as effective for me as they would be for you. And the athlete should come into a call with those things in mind. What are my goals? What am I looking for? How do I communicate, and how do I like other people to communicate back with me?
Well, it's so funny you mentioned the bright, shiny things. One of the brightest, shiniest things that athletes will point to when they come in. And I feel that this is more prevalent in the triathlon world and in specifically the Ironman triathlon world, but it might be just as prevalent in the ultramarathon world, where the shiny thing is my coach should have done the race that I am preparing for. I'm training for Ironman Lake Placid, and I'm looking for a coach that has done Ironman Lake Placid themselves. I'm training for the Western States 100, and by golly, I have to have a coach that has run themselves the Western States 100. And I always I have a little bit of an elite athlete bias on this, which, I'll kind of fully admit, but I always point out to one of our former coaches, Nick White, who coached Craig Alexander to multiple Ironman World Championships, not just one, multiples of them. And at the time, he had never run an Ironman before, ever. But because of how good he was as a coach, he was able to take Craig from a 70.3 world champion to an Ironman world champion. So I'm wondering what your viewpoint is on this very specifically on this bright, shiny object that is course specific. Like the coach has to have done the race that the athlete is training for. How important is that?
It's interesting because I've been in the same situation. Obviously, never been an elite athlete or anything else like that. But I come from that same world of how helpful is it going to be if this coach doesn't know where the transition area is or where the aid station is or how much climbing there is. And there's that little rocky section at mile 60. If they don't know about that, how could they I think those thoughts are very normal, but I think they're very short-sighted for an athlete. I do think I don't agree that a coach has to have done the event. I do think familiarity with the event is helpful. I think more so from a completely different sport side of things, that would change things. So if an athlete is they're training for a triathlon and a non-triathlon coach is coaching them for it, that I can see them not understanding transition in a triathlon or having pacers in an ultra marathon. Those type of things are things that really add to the sport and are going to change things dramatically. As far as having a coach that has done those things. And I think that's important. Having done the same course, I never think is important, although the athlete does.
Yeah.
So there's meeting that halfway. And I will, on a daily basis, I go out of my way to find coaches that have either run or coached a specific event that an athlete is doing. And I will typically try to have a coach that is familiar with the event. But there's not always an opportunity to have. I think there's a downside to having a coach that has done the event, and that would be they have their own biases on that particular event, and the athlete may not have that experience at all.
Yeah, it's from a coaching perspective, and I can tell this having mentored a lot of coaches, it is far more valuable to have coached multiple, several, dozens, 20, 30, 40, however many athletes for a particular event than it is for the coach to have run even the same amount of that particular event. So let's say a coach has run an event 10 times, right? I'm a 10-time Leadville Trail 100 finisher. The coach that has coached people for 10 Leadville Trail 100s will have a better, just the experience within that event because they've seen it through they've seen it through multiple angles and multiple eyes. They'll have better experience specifically related to the event than the coach who's done it 10 times themselves. Now, of course, the best, we don't have to, it's not an either or situation. The best is both. I mean, it is good, as you mentioned, to have experiential knowledge on certain things. And if you have done an event and are smart enough to not let that over bias your coaching, and you have coached multiple athletes for an event, personally, you can tell me what you think since you're the expert here. Personally, I think that's kind of like the Goldilocks from an experience standpoint. And then you get into the knowledge and all that other stuff. But from an experience from the event, if you had done it, and then you can remove the bias, and then you also have multiple athletes that have trained for it, I think that's the best of all worlds there.
It is the best of all worlds, but I think that as this relates to the coach consults, but which is kind of nice to bring us back to the beginning here, and that would be the personality of the coach. You're going to know in the first 10 minutes if that coach is hey, I've coached 10 athletes to the Leadville Trail 100. I've got so much knowledge on their experience going through the training and so forth that we can really apply to your experience out there this year from a nutrition standpoint, from an aid station standpoint, those type of things, rather than the other coach would be, so, I've done Leadville 10 times. I know everything about this event, and this is how it's affected me, and this is how I've done it, and this is how I've handled those things. If the athlete is doing their coach consult interview properly, they're going to hear that. I will say, as an aside, one of the really cool things about my job and working with the coaches at CTS is I almost never, ever hear that. I almost wish our coaches were a little less humble. There have been times where I've told athletes certain things about coaches after they've been there with them for 6 months or a year, and they had no idea that coach had, had the accomplishments that they had, which is great. But the point here being is that in that interview, you're going to feel, hey, do I relate to this person? Is this person coaching me? Are they talking about their accomplishments? Are they sharing with me what they've learned from their other athletes? Or are they dictating to me what they feel like they know? And that's part of that. That's part of that selection criteria.
Well, it's so funny that the humbleness, I think, comes from two areas. It comes from one, they don't have to be the salesperson. Like coaches who are also selling themselves are definitely prone to overselling themselves. Coaches that don't have to sell themselves, they don't have to mention all of the things that they've done, the degrees that they have, the experience that they have, the things that they've done personally and things like that, because they have good folks like you to lean on to help that sales process. But the second piece of it, and I'll have to apologize to you, Dominic, if our coaches being so humble is impeding your processes in any way, shape, or form. But it's a little bit of a byproduct of our training, because we are relatively difficult on our coaches during their initial training part of it, and part of that difficulty and kind of putting them through the ringer and making them prove their worth and kind of show their stuff. It definitely humbles even the best of coaches to where they realize they don't have to go out and beat their own drum or blow their own horn or whatever. Let's not go down that rabbit hole any further, because this is going to end up being a sales podcast, which I don't want to have happen.
No.
There's this other coach athlete aspect that you have to manage that I find absolutely fascinating, because you are the feedback filter within the company. Everything that goes good, bad, or indifferent between a coach and an athlete, you harness that feedback and you make sense of it somehow. The making sense of it somehow is more back-end procedural stuff that I don't really want to get into. But I think the relevant lesson to the audience is when it goes really good and when it goes really sour. So let's take both of those two parts. So first off, whenever you get feedback, I love my coach, I accomplished all my goals, they're awesome. We have athletes that have been with us for 10 years. I couldn't imagine, accomplishing this without my coach, so-and-so and such. What are the common themes from either the coach-athlete relationship itself or things that the coach is doing specifically that you see when you get that type of feedback?
The common themes with giving positive feedback for coaches and having a really successful relationship, experience, and accomplishment of goals is absolutely 100% identical to the reason that people call and make a complaint, have a problem with the relationship and everything. Every single time, it's the same as every single relationship in your entire life, and it will be communication. That is all it comes down to. It comes down to, and it comes down on several different levels. Communication, did they conduct the consult the proper way? Did they ask the questions that they wanted to ask? Did they listen to the answers that they got? Or did they just say, what do you think a week of training would look like for me? I'm training for, high lonesome, whatever it is. And the coach gives out some things, and that they're not even listening at that point. They're just, I'm talking to a coach, and that's it. And did they conduct that interview the proper way? And then did they continue that building the kind of boundaries for the relationship and communication once they finally got together with the coach that they selected? And that happens to be a really important part of this process. Is one of the things that I tell athletes after they've selected their coaches, their first call is so important. You have this opportunity, like we all would probably say in the back of our heads with every relationship we've ever had in our life, man, if I could go back to day one. And again, that's whether that's with a running buddy or a club or your coach or your husband or wife, it doesn't matter. If I could go back to day one, I'd start everything out as honest as possible. Hey, how do you like to communicate? Would you rather me email you or text you? Would you like me to give you a compliment each day? Or would you like me to really tell you the truth? Like, your intervals looked a little, all of those things. And I tell them that should be done from the athlete and from the coach. You should both have expectations that you should both be very clear on. And yes, that coach that's getting paid to be a coach should have expectations for the athlete. And they should say, hey, I can't be a good coach if you don't share the information with me. I can't be a good coach if you don't do your workouts. I can't be a good coach if you don't tell me how you want to communicate. And those things are all so important. And to say that those things don't happen, if everyone's done it properly, they do, because we're humans.
Well, but the interesting dichotomy that we have within coaching is that we give our coaches the flexibility to handle that communication. We give them great flexibility to handle that communication bit, whether it's a text a week, a phone call a week, looking at every training file on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We give them the flexibility to kind of assess up each athlete's situation and say, this is how I'm going to communicate with you. Is that good with you? Yes, no, okay. Now this is how we're going to kind of shuck and jive and change it as things go along. The other part of that dichotomy is that in athletes that are evaluating coaches are having to navigate this as well, is that on the front facing piece of the service delivery, this is what I'm doing for the coaching package. You get a Training Peaks account, you get X amount of my time or whatever. That communication piece, some people try to fit into a box. You'll see that across coaching services. You get 2 texts per week or 30 minutes of my time or 5 emails or whatever. They try to put that communication into a box, or it's ambiguous, and therefore the athlete is kind of left. Well, I don't know exactly what I get. So to your point of defining it from the onset, and it's always been really interesting because I know that we've batted back and forth a lot on how to present that communication piece in a frontward facing manner, like on our website, knowing that on the back end, we give our coaches tremendous amount of latitude on actually how to handle that piece.
Right. And it's funny. I know that you and I have had this conversation several times,
100
multiple
times.
times on, is it 5 texts and 2 emails? And it's funny because each time, and I remember when I first asked you that question, and I remember you saying, we'll never put that on the website, because the ultimate
that being quantifying the amount of, like, putting the amount of communication in a box, right?
Putting a number to it. Yes.
Yep.
And your response was, there isn't a number. We'll do what we need to do to provide the athlete with the training that they need. Of course, within reason, if that athlete needs to go to a higher package with more communication, sure. But what we all really know is sometimes you get 10 texts from an athlete one week, and then you don't get any texts for the next 3 weeks, and then there's 2 texts, and then there's 10 the following week. It all works out to spending the amount of time with the athlete that you should be spending. But the biggest thing is you're giving them what they need at the time.
Yeah. I always present. So when we bring our coaches on board, they always ask, well, how much time do I need to spend with each athlete? And I studied this within our company. This was before you came on board, and I looked at all of our coaches across all of our athletes over, it's like a year, 18-month type of period, and I came up with an average. I'm not going to publicly release the statistics of this particular very informal study that I did. But the relevance of the conversation is I will tell the incoming coaches, this is the average. And nobody believes me, because they always think of the one specific situation that's different than that. It's either 2x of that or half of the number that I mentioned. And then I go into the dialogue of, that's the average over many, many athletes over many, many years, not the instantaneous real-time athlete coach usage.
Right. That's why it's called an average.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's not divulge into any math. So it's interesting that this communication piece creates both the great relationships and also the sour ones. What specifically, though, on the great ones, because I want to focus on how people can actually do it right. What specific like communication points on the great ones do you find as like a consistent theme of feedback that you see when you're getting feedback from athletes?
The biggest one is that the athletes knew why they were doing what they were doing, and I think. I don't think that ultimately leads somebody maybe to their fastest time ever or whatever, but what it does is it, on a weekly or daily or biweekly, whatever it is, however your relationship is set up, and your whatever package you're on, you're getting constant feedback on I'm doing the right thing. I'm ready for my event. This week I am 13 weeks to being ready for my event. I am exactly where I need to be. I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing it, and I know what I'm going to gain from it. And that is probably the biggest thing, especially from athletes who have come from other coaches in the past. That's one of those things that they have that opportunity to kind of compare the two things. And they say, wow, I never got this. I never, or what they're asking for going forward. I've been with a coach in the past, but what I really need is, what I'm really looking for is, I'm looking for feedback. I want to know why, and I want to know why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that piece of experience as well, because whenever I have gotten athletes from other coaches, that mirrors the experience that you just mentioned. Is like the biggest change is, I would describe it as moving from a static training program to actually coaching. So we're looking at the training files, we're communicating on what certain pieces of training mean, what we see in the training files, we're getting on the phone every week and things like that, as opposed to, and this would be the situation of the athlete that was working with another coach. They got a schedule and there was like, okay, go do the schedule and we'll meet in another month when that schedule runs out, essentially. So it's that consistency of communication and like setting it up from the get-go that I think creates a lot of like great coach-athlete relationships.
Yeah, and that's what ultimately builds that bond. It is not specifically, I talk to a coach for 10 minutes a week. He puts a plan in my training peaks. I do it. He gives me a thumbs up, and then we move on to the next week. That doesn't build. That's not a relationship. That's again, it's no different than buying a canned program.
Yeah, it's schedule building, not coaching. That's the way I describe it. So the next thing I want to talk about is we're not perfect, right, Dominic? You would agree with that? We are not perfect.
You're talking about coaches, not me, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's exactly what I meant. Our coaches are not perfect. You, on the other hand, you are the shining beacon of light that we should all aspire to.
Oh, brother.
No. This is a little bit too much inside joke. Dominic, you're a good guy, but you're not perfect either. Sorry to tell you. But our coaches specifically are not perfect. And sometimes that coach-athlete relationship goes awry to the point where you have to say, I think another coach is better for you.
Correct.
What are the bigger driving points behind you having to make that decision? And let's remove the situations of the athlete comes in and says, I have to have another coach. Let's set up the stage or set up the scenario where the athlete comes and, hey, listen, I'm having this problem with my coach. You're kind of evaluating it. What things would you take into consideration to say, you know what? Because your role is, and I think this is an important piece of context with this conversation, your role is athlete services. You're there to serve the athlete, not serve the coaches. You're there to serve the athlete, to do what is in the best interest of the athlete. So in that scenario where an athlete comes to you and says, you know what, I've been having these issues with my coach. I can't quite figure it out, blah, blah, blah. What are some of the things that would lead you to start to go down this decision-making process of ultimately saying to the athlete, you know what, I think another coach would be a better option for you?
So the very first thing, without question, that leads me to that is I've already heard from the coach.
Oh, really? So coach contacted you as well.
I'm having trouble communicating with this athlete. I don't feel like they're listening to me, or whether they agree with some of my methodology or whatever it is. They're not giving me the feedback that I'm looking for, and I can already feel from them that this is where it's going now. Again, that tightrope that I walk in or anybody walks with it in a real customer service position is you can't just get on the phone with the athlete and say, I talked to the coach and he already said you're a problem.
Which would never happen, by the way.
But with that, I now know that is the direction that we should be going down, and kind of lead on some of the things that they've shared with me. And again, lobbing that out there and throwing that out there and say, hey, would you be interested in speaking to a couple of different coaches? See if there's a different match out there for you. And with that, you find out immediately from the athlete with their response. It's either one of two things. Oh no, I don't want to leave my coach. And they'll come right out and say to you, I know I said all those other things. I really just want to make sure that I get a full hour on the phone with them each week. Okay, well, great. You know what? If you're okay with it, I'd like to share this with your coach and talk to them about it. 100% of the time, Koop, I have spoken to coaches and they say, you know what? You're absolutely right. I need to do a better job with scheduling that call with that coach. And I have multiple emails from athletes that have emailed me back and said, hey, thanks so much for doing that. That's all we needed to do. Things are going so great with this, that now. So sometimes it really just comes down to asking a couple of questions and finding out what that need is. Now, there have been times where I've gone in the other direction and said, would you like to start talking about talking to a different coach? And the athlete immediately says, yes, I would like to do that. I think that's the best course of action. Also, if I get 2 or 3 emails that are 8 paragraphs long from an athlete, typically it's not a good idea, regardless of the willingness of the coach or the athlete to kind of come back together. In reality, it's not the best choice after a scenario like that has already happened.
Yeah, but you're basing your response based on like the intensity of how mad the athlete is, essentially. If they're kind of mad, then there's some conflict resolution that goes on. If you're hearing it from both parties, which would, that kind of escalates the intensity, certainly, you're going to shift more towards, hey, I think a new coach is the right choice for you. And then if you're getting the multi-paragraph, here's the laundry list of things that the coach has screwed up, which just does happen. I've had that happen to me. I've been coached for a long time. I've certainly made my number of mistakes. Those types of things are your clear indication that, okay, we're not going to pass go. We're going to find you a new coach. Here's some options. Let's talk what went wrong. How can we remedy this? But I guess the point that I'm trying to reemphasize here is that the intensity of how you're solving that problem, or how quickly you're moving an athlete from one coach to another is based on the situation.
Correct.
Are there any times where you've been able to do like some successful conflict resolution in those situations? And like, what do those look like?
It's probably one of the coolest things to be able to see it from email, another email, call with the athlete, angry exchange, gathering information. I talk to the coach, I go back to the athlete, and we get them together, and they decide they want to talk. And next thing you know, they've been together for the last 3 or 4 years and have had tons of success. And again, it just comes back. It comes back to communication and two individuals that are willing to say, I'm willing to listen, and I'm not always right. And you know what? Didn't realize that you were saying that. It's amazing what happens if we're willing to listen and understand the other side rather than immediately assume that we're correct.
I think we need to just change your title to like communications aficionado between coach and athlete or something like that.
I'm going to be like Cyrano. I also break up for athletes as well. I've broken up with athletes' old coaches for them as well.
So I've described you, I've colorfully described you as Match.com for athletes and our coaches. What's the other service? There's another service out there that will break up with your significant other for you. You can hire them to do it. Totally. Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but I'm sending them a resume right now.
No, please don't. We like you here at CTS, Dominic. All right, man. We're gonna let you go. I really appreciate the dialogue around communication that we've had here. Is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with that are out there trying to navigate this landscape of getting coaching for their ultramarathons, their athletic event? Anything that you can leave the listeners with in terms of how to set this up correctly?
Yeah, I would say that if at any point in time you've considered the need or want for accountability in your training, for somebody else to make sense of everything. If I had a nickel for every doctor or engineer who said, I could build a power meter and I could tell you everything about the human body. I just don't know what to do with the information to get me to peak for an event in 9 months. If all of those things, if those things go through your head, or what is your time worth? Are you willing to try to put this plan together? Schedule an appointment to talk to a coach. Ask them the questions. But I will say, if you decide to do that, come into it honestly and come into it with a plan of how you want this to look. And you can do anything you want as long as you let everybody know what you're doing. And coming in and speaking to coaches first and asking some honest questions of the coach and of yourself is really the most important thing.
I love it. I love it. One of your quotes that you just alluded to there is you can do anything you do anything you want. You just got to tell them what you're going to do.
Just let everybody know what you're doing. That's it. There's no surprises then. Even if they don't totally agree with it, they know what's going to happen.
And it works with coaching and in many other areas of life.
Absolutely.
All right, man. All right, Dominic, appreciate your time. I usually ask my guests before they get off the horn where they can find you at, but they're going to know where to find you at because we work together. And this, I do not intend to have this podcast be a total sales pitch for our coaching. I really do want it to serve a broader audience. So we're going to skip that in reference to that goal.
Yes, dude.
All right, man. Thanks,
That's
man.
how I roll, man.
Yeah. All right. Alrighty, folks, and there you have it. That was really fun. Always have a good time when I talk to Dominic. He has, I can't emphasize this enough. He's been doing this for years. He gets a tremendous amount of repetition in terms of matching incoming athletes up with new coaches. I hope that if you are in the market to get some coaching for your next event, or you just want to get coaching for something that you might even know is coming up later down the line, that you take Dominic's advice to heart, because alongside Dominic, I see both sides of the equation. I see it when athletes have great coach-athlete relationships and everything goes smoothly and they love their coach, they make tremendous amount of progress and they get a lot of value out of the coach-athlete relationship. But I also see the opposite side of that coin, not only within CTS every so often, but also out in the space where athletes, for whatever reason, they get matched up or they select a certain coach for whatever reason, and it just wasn't what they expected. So I hope that nobody out there who is getting into the market for coaching has to experience that, because that is quite tragic. I do feel that good coaching across the board, across all coaches, is good for coaching, meaning if somebody else coaches somebody excellently, that's kind of good for the gander. A rising tide raises all ships. And I believe that if athletes end up getting in touch and working with a high quality coach, hey, that's just good for everybody. And I love seeing athletes out there succeed. And so if you are in the market to get some coaching from somebody, I really do hope that you find somebody that works well with you and you continue to see progress. Appreciate everybody listening to this episode. If you have not taken the chance to give this podcast a rating or a review, go ahead, hop on over to iTunes and do that. That helps out this podcast a tremendous amount. Appreciate all your feedback. We will see you guys, as always, hopefully, eventually, out on the trails.